Students read about decolonizing anthropology, but often don't know how to decolonize habits in the classroom. Part of the problem is that students are taught to master a subject, to stay detached and unemotional while exploring a text. Is there a way of being in the classroom that might begin to flip what we do with knowledge more generally? In my 14-week-long environmental anthropology class, we build up to the topic of decolonizing anthropology after slogging through many classics like Julian Stewart or Roy Rappaport. Most students easily poke holes in the way that Stewart writes about the Shoshone as fossilized, or the way Roy Rappaport talks about Tsimbaga as being able to be studied in the same way one would study animals in an ecological study for functionalist purposes. Later on in the course, students receive materials more germane to local self-conceptions that decolonize anthropology, such as Paige West's Conservation is Our Government Now, or Julie Cruikshank's Do Glaciers Listen. But all these works are written by scholars with PhDs and academic posts. The students are left contemplating how anthropologists are forever translating across difference, and whether this can ever be done in a way that Indigenous societies approve of. I then give them Bruce Pascoe's book, Dark Emu, which is about Aboriginal Australia and the birth of agriculture. It re-examines colonial accounts of Aboriginal people in Australia to cite evidence for pre-colonial agricultural practices, engineering, and building. Oftentimes, when students think about Indigenous knowledge, or they've been given Indigenous knowledge in other anthropologies, they think of it as something cultural and mythical versus engaged with scholarly debates. In Bruce Pascoe's book, he's trying to say that Aboriginal Australians were in fact agriculturalists. This is the main argument of his book. Pascoe confirms that argument with settler journals and not Aboriginal stories. In fact, there are almost no Aboriginal stories in this book. The book itself is roundly attacked by the right. The right challenged the book for the way that it discredits European superiority. They also say Pascoe is not Indigenous or Aboriginal enough. And it's become increasingly attacked or criticized by archaeologists and linguists who say, well, Aboriginal Australians, should be proud of the heritage they left on this continent, but they're not really agriculturalists. So this is how I get students into these debates. Classroom day one is a standard critical approach to knowledge. Students read the book. I ask them to survey what they know about agriculture and domestication as anthropology and archaeology understands it. What have they learned in other classes so far? We then comb this book for Pascoe's technique, for his evidence of why he thinks agriculture exists in Australia by Aboriginal peoples. We then debate whether or not Pascoe is invested in a unilinear or multilinear theory of evolution, the kind Stewart was involved with. Is agriculture really superior? Is that the point he's trying to make? When you get to the book, you learn, no, that's not the point he's trying to make. But we get there. In classroom day two, we interrogate our own classroom assumptions, looking back at what we did on day one. Again, I remind students that Pascoe is an Aboriginal intellectual and an applied scholar. His main goal is to transform the way land is currently treated in Australia by heightening the importance and the sustainability of previous Aboriginal practices. Students then devise their own ways of being and responding in the classroom in relation to Pascoe's texts. Here are some student suggestions that were brought to me in class. The first one is that we need to do more knowledge sharing that is done with warmth and appreciation. Okay, so not just critiquing the book. The second is every time we try to make sense of knowledge, we colonize it. So can we just listen to portions read aloud, sit and contemplate, perhaps free write about those? Another suggestion was that we go outside and sit in one place on our own colonized campus landscape in Walla Walla, Washington, and that we actually use Pascoe's ideas considering how the place we are in, that we are looking at, diverges from and disrespects Indigenous creative relationships with the same space. So in conclusion, these are my learning outcomes for using this book. I want the space of the classroom and the techniques of the classroom to matter in how we receive and respect an Indigenous scholar who himself is playing with conventions and on the margins, or very cutting edge in comparison to scholars who have PhDs. Secondly, we consider what is being asked of Pascoe as an Aboriginal writer. What did we ask of him on day one when we use this more conventional method, asking for accuracy, objectivity, reliability, verifiability? Point number 3, which relates to point 2, we then think about facts and the way they find their way to us when we are assisted by theoretical schemes. Therefore, we go back to Julie Cruikshank's book and Paige West's book. We think about the decolonial theory that we learned earlier in this course. How can we apply it to being in the classroom, to thinking with Bruce Pascoe? And 4, we realize that maybe anthropology has lacked a conceptual toolbox for practices that are in between hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists, a point we will return to after this book is finished as we explore Anat Singh's wonderful critiques of the category domestication. Thank you. I welcome your questions.